Okay, let me start by talking about heat excess. What we want to do is talk about something that some people sometimes don't realize is a real problem. I spoke to the EnField Racial Harmony group a little while ago, Racial Equality Council, that is. Lots of people were talking about, it's great when summer comes, and they were reciting poems about it. And when I spoke about the problems we may face in the future, many of them said, I didn't realize that. I didn't realize there was that problem. But heat can be a killer, and it will become more so both globally and in the UK itself. Last year, we saw a whole series of extreme weather events, hurricanes, drought, floods, wildfires. In fact, last year, I was with my wife and we visited her sister in Alberta, Canada. They had been evacuated 3 weeks before we went there because wildfires actually had burnt the trees in their grounds. And when I went to see them, the trees were like charcoal sticks sticking up in the air, and the smell was acrid. And there were lots of record-breaking extreme events last year. And it's happening this year as well. I mean, we haven't had the greatest of summers ourselves, but meteorologists are saying that they think now by the end of the year, we will have had the hottest year on record. There were tremendous heats again in North America and in Arizona and the Northwest. Delhi, for example, New Delhi reached 120 degrees Fahrenheit. And that was pretty awful. It's almost impossible to work in those conditions. Indeed, the heating of the Earth now is trapping twice as much heat as it was 30 years ago, and that's caused by the emission of greenhouse gases into the environment. Now, in 2015, the United Nations, through the Intergovernmental Climate Panel, came to an agreement that local authorities, not local authorities, sorry, nations should voluntarily agree that by the end of the century, they will not increase temperatures by more than 1.5 degrees. Now, we've already reached that. It's likely by the end of this decade, we will certainly be over 1.5 degrees. And in the last 2 weeks, the United Nations produced an emissions gap report where they said if current policies continue, then we're likely to reach 3.1 degrees by the end of the century. And that's quite catastrophic because it means increases in extreme weather events, including heat waves and floods. Some scientists believe it's even worse than that. James Hansen, who was famous for first introducing man-made climate change to Congress in America in 1988, believes that we may pass some tipping points and we could even find ourselves between 4 or 5 or 6 degrees. And that's at the level of extinction for a lot of people. So it's a very serious problem if we don't tackle it now. At the moment, 30 million people today globally face extreme heat, and this is expected to rise by 2 billion by 1970. And as a result, the deaths from extreme heat, are likely to increase in Europe alone by 50-fold. Now, extreme heat will harm people, not just because they die because of extreme heat. It will affect all other aspects of our life. For example, food, and Ali will talk more about that. But 60% of our food is imported, and much of that food is produced in areas that have suffered floods or droughts or extreme weather that's destroyed that food. Indeed, heat has, since 2004, reduced land for growing food by 21%, and that is likely to grow. And a recent report has shown that climate change will also adversely affect water quality. And people and scientists are so concerned about water quality that they believe if we don't do something about that, then 50% of our food globally will be threatened. So it's pretty serious in that sense. So what do we mean when we talk about extreme heat? Well, from what I gather talking and reading about what geriatric consultants say, our bodies can only cope with 95 degrees Fahrenheit. That's about 40 degrees centigrade in heat over a few days. After that, our metabolism is affected. we begin to stop sweating, which is nature's way of cooling us down. We get confused. We sometimes collapse. We get heat stroke, and many, many people die. And for those over 65, it's not 95 degrees that affect them. It can be 80 degrees over a period of time. Now, the people who suffer the most from this are in several categories. One is pregnant women. The other is very young children whose metabolism has not developed yet, so they're immune to some of the higher temperatures. And it's vulnerable people. But most of all, it's older people. And it's older people living alone. And we'll talk about Paris in a minute because they face that problem. But it's also a problem because in the next few years, the older people in our society will grow and be a higher percentage of the total population. By 2050, the number of people age 60 and over will double to nearly 2.1 billion. And that makes 21% of the total global population. In Europe, it's even more, it's 25%. And we're in Europe. So 1 in 4 people will be over 65. And those people will suffer most. Now, this means that more than 20% of the world population, age 69 and older, will be living in regions where peak temperatures routinely surpass 99.5 degrees Fahrenheit, compared with just 14% today. Now, we may not think that will happen so much in the UK, but it will. Last year, there were 4,500 deaths because of extreme heat in the UK alone. And scientists predict that in the coming years, we will have heat more frequently over several days. One professor, Joanna Haig, who was a co-director of the Institute of Climate Change in Imperial College, believes that there is a likelihood that parts of the UK could theoretically average 40 degrees in the summer of 2050, and it could even peak to 45 or 50 degrees. And the Met Office has also said that by 2070, winters will be 4.5 degrees warmer and 30 degrees wetter, which means we will have a lot of flooding. Summer will be up by 6 degrees, which with frequent droughts and surging numbers of heat-related deaths. Now, obviously, to tackle this problem, we have to stop emitting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. We have to stop the fuel industry from doing that. And that's a national problem here, and it's a global problem as well. But we have to adapt as well, because even if we stopped all fossil fuel emissions tomorrow, there is enough carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and carbon dioxide lasts 1,000 years. There is enough carbon dioxide in the atmosphere for heating to be 1.52 degrees or maybe more at the end of the century, even if we did nothing. So we have to begin to adapt. Now, how can we do that? We need to really think that through. First of all, we could look at countries that have had this problem. In 2003, a huge heat wave hit Europe, and particularly France and particularly Paris, who bore the brunt of it. And in Europe, 70,000 people died. And so they faced a crisis because they hadn't developed a strategy. And we haven't either, because we haven't had that crisis. But since then, Paris did. And one of the first things they did was they created a database of all the vulnerable people living alone, people who couldn't get to cooling centers and so on. And they spent a lot of time doing that. And then with the health authorities there, and presumably I would think the voluntary sector as well, they visited those vulnerable people to do a vulnerable risk assessment to see how likely they are to suffer, to see whether they would need transport, because many people were old and they lived up in the top of those wonderful Paris buildings with aluminium roofs that were like ovens in a heated atmosphere. They visited them to see if they needed help. And the other problem they found was that they needed cooling centers, but some of them were a long way away. And if you were old and you were slow and you had to walk 30 minutes or more in 45 degrees centigrade temperature, that is awful, and you are likely to collapse and to die. So they've now developed a strategy where they've developed 800 cooling centers all around Paris, and no one is more than 7 minutes away from a cooling center. So they have looked at what they can do strategically. And that, I think, is really, really important. And that's something we could do here. Maybe we can talk about that later. Our local authority do have databases, but they're not comprehensive. And one part of the local authority doesn't know what database the other one has. We need to work with them and see if we can get them to develop a fairly comprehensive database of vulnerability, and then to look strategically at how they can develop cooling centres. They all talk about having one here or one there, but they haven't done what Paris has done, is looked at the area as a whole. And London hasn't done it either, so it has to be done in London as well as in Enfield itself. So that's, I think, one of the most important things that can be done. But I think as well, and I'm going to a PowerPoint presentation here, is that we can also do a number of other things which are important. For example, planting trees in cities is really important. They help to cool cities. Trees for Cities, an organization and a charity, did some interviews with people standing under trees on a hot day, and then took the temperature, and then took the temperature when they went away from the trees, and there was 7 to 9 degrees difference. And one professor in North America went out in the heat dome wave of 2 years ago with his son in a car, took the temperature in an area that was really deprived. There were no trees, there was dense housing, there were no green spaces, and he found the temperature was 124 degrees. He then drove to a plush area which had lots of trees, lots of green spaces, spatial housing, and he found that the temperature was 99 degrees. There was a 25 degrees difference. So planting trees and planning that strategically is really important. Another thing that can be done is to paint roofs white. Now, it may not make a huge lot of difference in some people's minds, but it is quite important in the sense that it can reduce temperatures by about 3 degrees, as well as cutting building energy use by up to 20%. And that is done quite extensively in New York, for example, where they have a York City Cool Roofs project where young people are trained to do that. And they have a lot of roofs now covered in white paint, which helps to combat the cooling. Another thing that can be done is to paint the concrete pavements and roads in a lighter color. They're now developing concrete, for example, that can reflect the heat rather than absorb it. The concrete we have in roads now tends to absorb the heat and make what is a sort of urban heat belt, which makes it much hotter than it is in the countryside outside. And some countries are starting to do that. Tokyo has been a good example of that, where they painted a lot of their roads white, and they've started using what's called solar blocking paint, which has been developed. And that has had the effect of actually reducing temperatures of something like 8 degrees. Then there's the number of cities have started as well, planting greenery on roofs and on the side of walls. Victoria, Melbourne has done that, Barcelona has done that, and Toronto has got an eco-roof incentive program where they've tried to plant greenery on much of the roofs, combined, as you can see, with solar panels, and that has an effect as well. And again, when new housing is being built, it can be done in a heat-sensitive way. Long before central heating was invented, back to Roman times, they used to build that way, where you had corridors, green corridors, which enhanced ventilation. And it was built so it could take the wind, it could take the cooling. And planning in a different way to what we do now is important. In the 60s and the VAS and the 50s and the VAS building, I think people just built, they did not think of building in a sensible way that it adapts to the climate they were facing. And finally, in a big way, people can develop sponge cities. Now, sponge cities are cities which has a whole series of natural areas, such as trees, lakes, and parks, and planned in a fairly extensive way. And if they do it, and you see the picture there, it helps to stop flooding or prevent flooding, and it also cools the environment. Now, the country who's done that most of all is China. And in the city of Wuhan, they have declared themselves the first sponge city. They have 16 areas developed. And now there are a number of cities in China developing this sponge city project. And by 2030, participants must ensure that 80% of the urban land includes sponge features. Now, that is a fairly strategic way of doing things, but it's something we need to talk about. We need to talk about it with our MPs. We need to talk about it with our local authority as well. And we've got a section in this meeting in a minute after Ali has spoken to look at how we can take this forward with local authorities and MPs and how we can try and strategically tackle the problem. Because if we don't, then we're facing a very, very serious future, because it's been predicted that by the end of the century in Europe alone, if we go on in the same way as we are now, 150,000 people will die every year. So it's as serious as that. So when we think of heat, it's nice to sit in the garden, it's nice to be in the sun, but as it gets hotter and hotter, it's going to be an existential problem. That's a problem for here and now. So let's see if we can talk about it and then see how we can move forward.